Hello and good morning, everybody. It's me, Julian. Welcome to the Monday morning Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. This is going to be the second lecture in a 12-week course on the concept of subjective destitution, which is a key concept within Slavoj Zizek's reworking of the Lacanian framework of fantasy. In fact, what we're going to do today, what I would like to propose is a close reading of a passage in Zizek's book, Sex and the Failed Absolute, namely page 370 to 371, in which he gives us a pretty clear definition of subjective destitution and how it relates to the subject. In fact, the title of this lecture is going to be The Failure to Be. And of course, the question is the failure to be the question is the failure to be what? Namely, subject. The failure to be subject equals subject. Or, as Zizek puts it, subject is the quote-unquote void of its own failure to be. That's what we're going to be discussing today. I would like to briefly say hello to everyone joining us from around the world. I'm so glad that you're here. The goal of this ongoing live stream lecture series is to have a somewhat longer video format that mimics and mirrors what you might call a university discourse, which is to say it's a shared environment in which we have a longer textual philosophical engagement that is hopefully a little bit more fulfilling than the 10-minute shorter videos that I post as well. I see a comment from someone saying, I am somewhat of a void of failure myself. A wonderful insight, and I hope that this is a pleasurable state of being. Let me begin very briefly by saying that I'm so grateful for your time and your attention and for the community that we have created here. It really means a lot to me. And thank you also to the patrons who allow me to keep hosting these online sessions. My latest ebook, which is part of my recurring ebook subscription, in fact, I release an ebook at the end of every lecture series, is titled The Silence of the Drives, which is an introduction to the concept of the death drive, or Todestrieb. But let's begin the lecture. We are already 2 minutes in, as it were. So, before I begin with the close reading of this passage on subjective destitution, I'd like to start with a seemingly simple question, namely, what exactly is subjective destitution? And there's actually a pretty good example of subjective destitution on the very back of the book, in which we have the author bio for Slavoj Zizek. And I suspect that the author bio is actually written by Zizek himself, as it really does describe him quite well in his own terms. It says, Slavoj Zizek was born, is writing books, and will die. It's a great author bio, I think. The author, Zizek, was born, is writing books, and will die. And within this brief formula, we have what essentially amounts to subjective destitution. It's the idea that Zizek's entire life is dedicated to writing books. He was simply born so that he might write books and then die. And yet, this isn't a monk-like existence. In fact, it's the other way around. It's because Zizek has a singular purpose in life, which is to write said books, that he can enjoy his life. He can read other books and watch movies and think about how they go back into his books. In other words, subjective destitution, to put it very simply, and please note that this is a simplified version of what it actually is the process by which one makes oneself radically subject to something. Zizek was born, he is writing books, and he will die. He is a vessel for the writing of books, as it were. As we will see later in this lecture, and perhaps throughout this lecture series, after all, this is only the second week, there's an important distinction here between subjective destitution and perversion. Perversion, which appears to some extent to be subjectively destitute, I live only for the pleasure of the other, nevertheless contains a form of repression that subjective destitution does not have. Anyway, I digress. Let us simply begin. So, if you'll allow me, I would like to begin with a close reading of page 370 to 371 of Sex and the Failed Absolute. And if you're curious about this book, this is one of the more recent theoretical books by Zizek. And what surprised me about it is that it's a very, if you will, concise, and what I mean by concise is not that it is short, but it's very to the point, a concise elaboration of most of his key ideas over the past 20, 30 years. In fact, it really serves almost as a look back at all of his previous arguments and books, and it lays it out quite clearly. Um, for example, his arguments about Hegel and Kant are put here very clearly. Their relationship to the theory of Freudian Lacanian sexuality and sexual difference in particular. It's a really technical book. It's quite difficult, but if you're looking for an overview of Zizek's thought, this is actually a pretty good one, I think. That is Sex and the Failed Absolute, which was published with Bloomsbury Press. I believe they're academic in print. Bloomsbury Academic, yes. So I will direct your attention, if you will, to page 370. And this is going to be a somewhat lengthy passage, but I promise you that we will break it down step by step afterwards, so fret not. Essentially what Zizek is doing on this page, on these pages, is giving a definition of subjective destitution and why it matters for the subject and his definition thereof. He writes, to put it succinctly, the subject is interpolated, the interpolation fails, and subject is the outcome of this failure. Subject is the void of its own failure to be. Now, in this opening passage, we have a really succinct definition of subjectivity in a Zizekian Lacanian sense. Key here is the word interpolation. The subject is interpolated. Now, unless you're already familiar with Althusser, then this might strike you as a piece of jargon that is difficult to understand. But within Louis Althusser's theory of interpolation, interpolation is essentially the call in which the subject appears to recognize himself. The example that Althusser uses is a policeman who is chasing a suspect, and he yells out in the street, "Hey, you there." At this point, even if you're not the subject and you turn around to face the policeman, you have been interpolated, as it were. You heard the call and you recognized yourself in it. On a basic level, and this is part of Althusser's argument, all ideology functions on the level of interpolation. For example, an advertisement on television will be seeming to directly address you, tapping into your subconscious desires. In fact, even manufacturing said desires. Here's the car that you need, here's the house that you want to buy, etc. Ideology thereby is the creation of a system of desires that give us a sense of order amidst the chaos of our own longings. It tells us what to dream, it tells us what to think, what to desire. It gives us a framework of fantasy through and in which we recognize ourself. And we feel relieved for a moment because we now have a handhold, a tangible sense of what life might be for or about. Of course, the critique of contemporary ideology is that these manufactured desires give us a reduced form of life, what you might call alienated life. We don't actually tap into a better life by means of buying a bigger car or a bigger house, etc. And so for Althusser, interpolation is at the core of subjectivity. It is the process by which the subject appears momentarily to recognize itself in the call of the other. And the subject, who has no formal grounding of his own, therefore needs to find himself in this interpolation. But what's crucial is that the interpolation fails. In a sense, the message is received by the subject, and yet the message is not for him. As Zizek puts it, the subject is interpolated, the interpolation fails, and subject is the outcome of this failure. To put that perhaps even more simply, the subject is not subject because he exists fully integrated into his life world. He has everything he needs, he's fully at peace, etc. Instead, the subject becomes subject proper, becomes human proper, at the exact point that he feels out of joint, that he feels out of place, that he is decentered, as it were. For example, let's say that you have completely controlled your surroundings. Like you have the perfect house, the perfect partner, the perfect job, the perfect car. You have everything you could ever need in order to be happy. And yet, somehow you're still not happy. This is the properly subjective stance. The stance of why now that I have everything that I ought to have to be happy, why now does it nevertheless elude my grasp? Does it slip through my fingers, as it were? In fact, this is even true for love. Think about the lover who's just had the perfect date with the with their loved one. They've gone out, Lou Reed, they've gone out to the zoo and petted the animals, etc. And at the end of the day, they're about to go to bed, they kiss each other good night, and suddenly one of them wakes up and thinks to themselves, is this really love? Is this really how it's supposed to feel? Here we have the properly subjective stance. The subject who, even when everything is completely perfect, nevertheless begins to doubt whether he has full access to the symbolic, as it were. In other words, Zizek writes, subject is the outcome of failure of interpolation. Subject is the void of its own failure to be. To put that into a bit of an aphorism, you are most yourself when you feel least yourself, as it were. The subject who is radically questioning who or what he is, and why or what he is feeling, and how to act and respond, this is the properly subjective stance on life. To be fully immersed in your surroundings, in your life world, in an unquestioningly bovine form of contentment is therefore not subjectivity. It's a form of plasticity, as it were. Let's continue our close reading, and thank you for your attention. Zizek continues, subject as the void which eludes objectivization is, however, not the last word of Lacan. If it were to be the last word, we would not be dealing with the Lacanian subject, but with the Sartrean subject as the self-negating void. So Zizek is making two arguments here. Argument number one, the subject eludes objectivization. Subject is the void, which is the void of failed interpolation. That much we understand. But this isn't Lacan's point. If this were simply Lacan's point, that the subject is the void of its own failure to be, this would not be Lacan, this would be Sartre. Consider the Sartrean maxim, life is what you do with what others have done to you. Here we have the Sartrean void of subject, which is to say there's no authentic grounding a priori content of the subject, save for how the subject chooses to create himself against the backdrop of his own impotence. In other words, possibility and the subject's own positing, it takes place as staged against the subject's impossibility, the fact that he is always already predetermined by the other. Hell is other people, as it were, to somewhat misappropriate that quote. However, this is precisely not Lacan's point. Instead, quote unquote, the Lacanian subject is decentered, not in the simple neurobiological sense that its psychic life is determined by neurological processes, of which it is by definition unaware, but in a much weirder sense. As we have already seen, the subject exists. It retains its identity only insofar as part of its psychic content, its traumatic core, what Freud calls its fundamental fantasy, is inaccessible to it, cannot be subjectivized, accepted by it, integrated into its symbolic universe. Here we have a very long, almost Proustian sentence from Zizek, which might require some breaking down. Let's start with this. The Lacanian subject is decentered. So what does it mean to be decentered? Well, if you will, the decentering of the subject is the central modern philosophical interpretive gesture or mechanism. It's the central hermeneutic approach. For example, this starts even with the empirical scientific turn within Galileo. Galileo decenters the subject quite radically by suggesting that man is not in fact the center of the universe as he once believed, but instead is a mere speck of dust, as it were, a flesh bag on a planet revolving around the sun, not the other way around. Here we have what you might call the decentering or the humiliation of man, modern man. In this sense, science and empiricism, as Galileo already practiced it, not only decenters the subject, but instead does something even worse, which is to say, the scientific turn suggests that the subject's own senses can't be trusted. Think about like a flat earth theorist. He says, well, science tells me that the earth is round, but if I look out my window, it looks pretty flat to me. Here we have the failure of common sense, the failure of the self-perception, the sense perception of man. The scientific empirical turn, therefore, decenters the subject from his own sense perception by means of using mathematical formulas and scientific empirical practice. This means that we can deduce the truth as to the functioning of the universe, but we can't necessarily see it as such. Hence, to my mind, why one of the first experiments that high school kids participate in, or elementary school children even, is that they look through a microscope. Because by means of looking through the microscope, we have the fusion, if you will, of sense perception with that which cannot be perceived directly by the senses. In other words, it has to be mediated by the microscope, which therein inverts the process of mediation that occurs within the telescope, the image of the Enlightenment par excellence, to see beyond that which can ordinarily be seen and to think that which might otherwise not be able to be thought. In fact, in the film, the latest Planet of the Apes films, The Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, we have a beautiful scene in which the ape looks through the telescope and for the first time realizes that the world may actually be accessible by means of what Hegel would have called abstract reason instead of simply sense perception. This is, of course, a key civilizational moment. But enough about that. This decentering of the subject, therefore, occurs with the empirical scientific revolution. But arguably, it also finds its philosophical equivalent. After all, the Kantian critique of pure reason also achieves a decentering of the subject. In this precise sense, one has to see the Kantian attempt at a metaphysics, his prolegomena, as it were, as an empirically minded approach, namely a Humean skeptical rationalist approach to idealism. Namely, once again, it's about the decentering of the certainty of the subject. The central Kantian premise is, what are the preconditions that must take place in order for the subject to even begin thinking essence as such? In other words, instead of conceptualizing essence or the ideal, he takes a step back so as to reflect upon what grounding the subject might stand so as to even make this assumption in the first place. Hence, he decenters the idea of the subject. Of course, the Kantian cop-out is that he nevertheless holds true to the idea of a thing in itself, an ideal transcendental substance, which cannot be known by the subject. He doesn't go far enough, as it were. Hence why Zizek has argued that Hegel doesn't simply contrast himself with the Kantian formalism, but Hegel essentially is more formalist than Kant himself by means of raising formalism to the level of the absolute. But that is for another lecture. The final, if you will, decentering of the subject, therefore, in this precise sense of the modern decentering of the subject, occurs with Freud. The Freudian, well, I should add, not just Freud, but Freud and Darwin. Darwin, of course, is the first great influence here. The Darwinian humiliation of the subject, the decentering of the subject, is similar to the Galilean one. Galileo argues that man is not the center of the universe, but that instead he simply is a tiny little piece of it. The Darwinian insight, his theory of evolution, as we all know, is that man is not, in fact, the chosen one, the sacred descendant, the son of Adam, but instead the descendant of ape, a mere particular emergence against the contingency or chaos which we call evolution. This decentering of man, kicking man off this idealized pedestal, also takes place within Freud. The Freudian decentering of the subject is to suggest that man is not, in fact, the master of his emotions, of his true intent. Instead, man is precisely the staging ground for what Freud calls repression, which is to say, the process by which our actions, thoughts, and thereby our speech as well, is influenced or mediated in advance by means of repression. This goes against the Victorian idealization that man is a gentleman who can essentially rein in his lower forces, Jekyll and Hyde. Instead, man is the very excessive feature. Subjectivity is the very symptom of repression as such. Hence, the Galilean, Darwinian, Freudian, Kantian, Hegelian innovations all revolve around the decentering of the subject, the de-essentialization of subjectivity as such. Now, with this lengthy commentary, you can see why Zizek says that the Lacanian subject is decentered, not in the simple neurobiological sense that its psychic life is determined by neurological processes of which it is by definition unaware. In other words, the modern scientific contemporary decentering of the subject is to say, well, even though you think you are a subject, actually it's just pheromones. Actually, it's just brain processes or behavioral economics. Your thoughts are not your own, etc. In other words, Zizek is contrasting Lacan here, the Lacanian decentering of the subject, with what you might call the hermeneutics of suspicion, the standard orthodox Marxist critique of ideology as a kind of puppet master that is secretly controlling your actions and your intentions. Your desires are not your own, they're manufactured. The parties that you vote for aren't actually of your choosing, they're what you are being presented with, blah, blah, blah. This paranoia, if you will, paranoid hermeneutic or interpretation of the subject is contrasted here with the Lacanian one. The Lacanian argument is precisely not that your true instincts are being manipulated by some ideological other against your own intention. Instead, it is that there is no authentic core. There is no inner you who is being manipulated. In fact, for Lacan, the ultimate fantasy is precisely this idea of an essential core of the subject which exists a priori, which can therefore be tarnished or mediated in some sense. And to go back to Zizek's text, he says, the subject exists for Lacan. The subject exists. It retains its identity only insofar as part of its psychic content, its traumatic core, what Freud calls its fundamental fantasy, is inaccessible to it. Now, here we have the introduction of the term the fundamental fantasy, which I already talked about last week. And Zizek here says that the fundamental fantasy is something that Freud uses. Personally, I have not seen Freud use the concept fundamental fantasy. And so I was a little bit confused by that part. It might be that one of you in your close reading of Freud has discovered a Freudian, or in German, expression of fundamental fantasy. The closest I can get to is the kind of like a Urvorstellung, a kind of universal fundamental form of repression. But that doesn't seem to correspond to the idea of a fundamental fantasy. So that's aside. I'm not entirely sure why Zizek attributes fundamental fantasy directly to Freud, although the theory of fantasy certainly comes and derives from Freud. I'll talk about that in a moment. The point here is that the subject exists and retains its identity only against the traumatic core of its fundamental fantasy. And what is the fundamental fantasy? It is the idea of a true, authentic me. And yet, the key Zizekian Lacanian distinction here is that the closer the subject gets to his authentic identity, or the space where it ought to be, the more the subject it disintegrates. In other words, as long as the subject can believe that there is some inner essential core of his being, he can immerse himself in the symbolic just fine. He can think that he is acting in correspondence with his own self, as it were. However, the closer he gets to being confronted with his authentic desire, the more the subject disintegrates, the more destructive it is. This is, to simplify somewhat, this is one of Lacan's arguments, which is to say, desire has to remain out of reach because it creates the very staging ground for subjectivity. Therefore, it would be catastrophic for the subject to get what it wants, because desire itself would disappear. And seeing as desire is constitutive to the subject, without desire, the subject would disappear or crumble as well. There's two ways to read this. The obvious sort of common sense way, which is you're unhappy as soon as you get what you want, because as soon as you've gotten what you want, it's no longer desirable, because what made it desirable was the fact that you thought that you couldn't have it. In other words, it becomes symbolically void. I think we've all experienced the anticlimax of receiving that which we want. Like a collector who spends 20 years collecting something will often be disappointed at the exact moment that he completes his collection, and will often then sell it without any kind of sentimental feeling. After all, the point of the collection lies in the collecting as such. As soon as it is complete, it's totally pointless. It simply sits there and almost seems to mock you. In fact, the truly happy person, in that sense, would be the person who finds a collection that is never ending, that can keep on going on and on and on. In this precise sense, Zizek himself is a collector. He is a collector of ideas and insights that he can put in books for his readers. The collection, therefore, the process of this stretched out, if you will, desire, is what allows the subject to ground himself into the symbolic universe as such. As Zizek writes, if the subject gets too close to it, the subject disintegrates. As soon as you've accomplished it, there's no staging ground for your subjectivity. Subjectivity disappears. The second reading, this is the common sense reading, the second reading is that subject is therefore a kind of mirage, a kind of illusion. We only see ourselves against the backdrop of some kind of pursuit, of some kind of necessity. For example, I identify as a partner, I identify as a sibling, I identify as a son. In other words, all these identifiers that you have are strictly speaking abstractions that exist in relation to the other. The other, therefore, creates the symbolic universe against which you stage yourself. Whether it's to be a good parent, a good brother, a good son, or perhaps precisely to resist the familial bond, to say, I will not be like my parents, etc. As Oscar Wilde already quipped, the tragedy is that every woman becomes her mother and no man does. Here we have essentially the Oedipal tragedy, as it were. The woman who doesn't want to be like her mother and nevertheless becomes like her, and the man who desperately wishes to be with and in his mother, as it were, to become her, and is forever barred by her, from her by the name of the father. Anyway, let us conclude the Zizekian passage here. Thank you for your attention. After all, we're running out of time. Zizek writes, what this means is that the Lacanian subject is not objectless. It exists only as separated from its objectal counterpart, its fundamental fantasy. He says, Lacan's premise is that we can not integrate, subjectivize the fundamental fantasy, but suspend it, its structuring power, and he calls this radical move traversing the fantasy. The price of this move is, of course, high. It involves what Lacan calls subjective destitution, which is not the disappearance of the subject, but its reduction to a 0 point, the disintegration of its entire symbolic universe, and then its rebirth. This is an almost Nietzschean passage here, I think, the idea that the subject could achieve a kind of death which leads to rebirth, a kind of rejuvenation of the spirit, etc. And yet what Zizek is doing here is actually quite extraordinary. He's being as concise as he will ever be. He's essentially saying that subjective destitution is the price we pay for traversing the fantasy, the fundamental fantasy. And yet not only is it the price we pay, but it is also that which we gain. Therefore, the loss that occurs within traversing the fundamental fantasy equals the very thing which is gained from it. The price to be paid is high, and yet the prize equals the price, as it were. To simplify somewhat, Zizek's basic formula, or his explanation of Lacan's formula, is this. The subject has a fundamental fantasy. This is who or what I am. And I do not doubt it. It exists. It's true. You might tell me otherwise, but I feel myself to be myself. I think, therefore, I am. However, in order to properly access what you might call subjectivity, one has to overcome this fantasy. One has to kill it. One has to stage the death of the subject. And the name for this death is subjective destitution, the becoming zero of the subject. And what does subjective destitution mean? It means that I give myself completely to something other than myself. An athlete practices subjective destitution in the pursuit of a trophy. A philosopher like Zizek practices subjective destitution in writing his books. A psychoanalytic theorist like Lacan practices subjective destitution by being the other to his patient in his sessions. This process of disappearing, if you will, the ego crumbling, isn't simply the reduction of the subject to some kumbaya, saint-like existence, but precisely the not selfless, but in fact very selfish act by which the subject properly reclaims his subjectivity. Therefore, the price to be paid, the illusion that you give up, that you have a core at your very being, that you are a precious person who has to assert yourself in your surroundings and live your best life, etc., has to be given up so that you might win back yourself, stage a rebirth. And this is something that you'll see even in self-help videos. Self-help videos that tell you, like, don't go out with your friends and play and spend money, stay home and, grind it out and work hard, etc. And whilst this is a vulgarization of subjective destitution, at least to the extent that it simply continues and extends a capitalist injunction, which is to say you must be an individual who is fighting for yourself against everybody else so that you might acquire status and fame and wealth, etc. And who will be laughing in the end because they will have fun and they will have had fun and yet you later will have riches, etc. The problem about this libidinal economy, which therein is precisely capitalist, is that it posits that the other is having fun. While I'm at home grinding it out, other people get to have fun, partying, etc. But I will make the sacrifice so that someday I will be rich, and who will be laughing then? This is precisely not Lacan's argument. Lacan's argument is the other way around. The people who think they're having fun aren't having fun. It's you who's having fun being at home, studying or writing or working on your craft. The true pleasure or enjoyment lies precisely within this subjective destitution. But if you stay home, resenting the other for his happiness and thinking that one day you will make money by means of your pursuit, then you've got it all wrong. The pursuit is itself what makes you happy. In fact, this is like, this is like when artists refuse the Nobel Prize or something like this. Of course, there's a certain theatrical gesture to saying, I don't need your prize, but it's also because they're perfectly content. They know the value of their worth. They like what they do. They don't need other people to validate it. The decentering of the subject is completed, subject who becomes decentered from himself, subjective destitution. At this point, you are content. You know your worth. You know what you're doing. You give yourself completely to it, and you don't need other people to validate it for you, which means that you're also not imagining that they're happier and that you're making this big sacrifice so that someday you might win. The loss is itself its gain. The thing which you sacrifice is itself what makes you happy. Hence, when you find something that you give yourself to completely, subjective destitution, you have essentially achieved what you might call a rebirth of sorts. You have found something worth living for. Now, it's difficult to do this, and it's never complete. Neither Zizek nor Lacan advocate that there's a step-by-step program or protocol that you might undertake in your own life. Instead, it is simply the assumption that the modern subject is decentered from himself. Who am I? Why am I? There's no certainty, no central grounding, no presupposition upon which the subject can base the ontological security of his very being. Against this backdrop, this failure to be subject, the first step is to radically assume that this failure is subject as such. Therefore, subject is the failure to be. And once you have accepted that the failure to be is subjectivity, you have already overcome the first step of the fundamental fantasy. The second step is to practice subjective destitution. Subjective destitution is the process by which you embrace this failure, the failure to be. And every day you try again, like Sisyphus pushing the boulder up that hill. And like Sisyphus, potentially, as Marcuse observed, you are happy. Or perhaps not happy, you are in some way accessing life. You are living it for a reason, which gives you a form of contentment. Like a photographer who says, I take pictures because that's how the world is interesting to me. Like a filmmaker who says that reality is not enough. He needs to mediate it through his camera. Like a writer who isn't simply telling stories, but is expressing the inexpressible, who is trying to write about the breakdown of language by means of using language as such. These mediations, if you will, are how we traverse the fundamental fantasy and how we decenter the decentered subject, turning him inside out, as it were, and therein access what might be a semblance of true or authentic subjectivity, the rebirth of the subject against the backdrop of his failure to be. Thank you very much. That is as concise as I can make it for today. If you're curious, this is page 370 and 371 of Zizek's Sex and the Failed Absolute. And if you'd like to learn more about this, I will continue this lecture series next Monday on subjective destitution. And next week, we're going to be talking about fantasy, how fantasy works for Lacan and Freud, and why it's important for Zizek. Until then, thank you very much for your attention. It has been my absolute pleasure to start my week with you. And if you'd like to download my latest ebook, as well as the complete guide to Zizek, volumes 1 through 8, those are still on Patreon. Thank you so much. I will see you soon.